In our previous videos, we have seen what is a promise is, what are the different states of it, and we have also seen what are the methods present in promises and when we can use those methods. In this video, we are going to understand the difference in terms of mentality or thinking when we look at callbacks or promises. So here we have a function called fetchData. What it is doing is it is creating an instance of XMLHttpRequest. After that, using getRequest, we are opening the URL. And whenever that load is done, we are calling this function, and here we are logging the message by parsing XMLHttpRequest. Then we are sending the request. So if you try to take a look at this code, what is happening here is whenever we are calling this function fetchData, this function will be called right now. But the function that you have added to onload, it is going to get called in future when the data is loaded properly. Otherwise, if something goes wrong, onError will be called, but we do not have any onError right now. So whenever you look at the callback pattern as we are doing it here, we are sending a callback to onload. So we do not have any control on what is happening with fetching the data on the URL when we are using callback. It is very similar to going to the burger shop and the burger shop is not giving you a receipt. Because it is not giving you a receipt, it is very hard to know what is the status of your order, whether it is done or not. And that is the problem of inversion of control, is because as soon as we call this function is going to do whatever is defined here. Here in the code that is running right now, I cannot take control of that. So now when you save it, refresh it, it will just log the message after fetching the data in a JSON format. And that is what we are doing here. So you call this function, it will accept a URL. Using getRequest, you're getting the data from the URL. When the onload is done, you are just calling this function. And that's why you see the log message here. But what if you want that receipt using which you can understand whether the data is loaded or not, or what is the status of my data? So that is where promises comes in play. So what we are going to do, we are going to create another function, but this time we'll call it fetch. So the one with callback is fetchData, but one with promises is going to be just fetch. Now think about it. How can you return a receipt in JavaScript? The way we do that is using promises. So we'll say return new promise. And we know that promise accepts a resolver function. So that will keep it here. This resolver function gets access to two functions, that is resolve and reject. Now we'll do the similar thing that we are doing it here. The only thing we did here is we wrapped this whole thing that we are doing inside a promise. Why a promise? Because promise acts like a receipt or a placeholder value that will resolve to any other value in future. And here, when do you want to resolve this? Whenever the data load is done properly, I just want to resolve it. So do you want to send some data when you're resolving it? Obviously you want to send that. Say resolve with json.parse, and here we'll say xhr.response. You cannot do this because onload accepts a function reference. Here we are passing a function call. So let's just wrap them into a function, right? Similarly, what if you want to handle reject? When do you want to reject this promise? I want to reject this promise whenever error happens. Now, here, when we are rejecting it, we'll just write a message saying something went wrong. So now, let's go ahead and call this. So I'm just going to comment out this one so we don't see the message that we have already seen earlier. And here, we'll call just fetch. Fetch is accepting a URL and returning a promise. That promise gets resolved whenever data load is done properly, and it is rejected whenever there is any kind of error. So here we are calling fetch. What we want to do, because this fetch function is returning a promise, let's just store it into a variable called data. Now let's refresh it. So here when you look at data, you'll see that this is a promise and it is already fulfilled. And what is the data it is fulfilled with? It is fulfilled with xhr.response. But what if you want to see the pending state, then you want to look at fulfilled, what you can do here? So what we can do is, so we are resolving it as soon as onload is done. So what if, just to understand the difference, let us call this function after 5 seconds. So here we'll call this function but after 5000 milliseconds. So what we are doing here is, as soon as onload is done, you have to call setTimeout, and that is going to take 5000 milliseconds, and after that we are going to resolve with xhr.response. So we can look at the data at any given point of time, right? So let's save this, refresh it, I'll look at data and you'll see it is in pending state right now. So the difference in callback pattern is, whenever you're using callback pattern, you do not have anything that you can look at and understand what is going behind the scene, or you can look at the status of the data fetching. But when we are using promises with XML HTTP request, we can do that because we are returning promises. In the starting it is pending, but now when we look at it, you will see that the promise status is fulfilled, and here we can see that the result is undefined, and here the result is object. So promise is just a wrapper around a value on which you can do certain tasks. You are like, okay, only if it is done, go ahead and do that, right? So here in this case, the promise got fulfilled, but what if the promise got rejected? So we can just go in network, and here instead of online, we can make it offline. Now let's refresh it, we'll look at data, and here we can see the promise is rejected. Because here we are not using setTimeout, so we can just look at the value. So if you want to do that, we can copy it from here and we can paste it here. And instead of calling resolve, let us call reject. We have added onError that also has a setTimeout. Let's refresh it here, look at data. You will see the data is pending right now with the value of undefined. Here, if you look at data now, you can see that it got rejected and with a message something went wrong. So can you understand how powerful it is? Like, what we can do now is we don't have to depend on a function like fetchData that is going to do the right thing. Here, what we can do is, we know that we are going to fetch this data, and we also know that promise gives us access to 3 methods: catch, then, and finally. So then is called whenever the promise is fulfilled, catch gets called whenever the promise is rejected, and finally is called in both case scenario. So here we are going to just get access to the value that is data, or you can call it user data, and here we can just say console.log data.name. But if something goes wrong, you can just be like catch, and here you will get access to the error, and what we can do, we can alert a message saying check your internet connection. And you can also add finally, but it is not necessary here. Finally is necessary whenever you want to do one task that needs to be done after .then or after that catch. That is when you use it, you don't need it here. So now what is happening is, in the case of callbacks, we were sending the function here and we were not having huge control on it. But here we have control on it. We are like, this is the code that is going to run in present. It is going to do the thing. So it will let me know as soon as the data fetching is done. And because data fetching is done, I will have access to data. If data fetching is not done properly, I will have error. Means either case scenario, I will get either data or error. Once I get data or error, based on that, I can do whatever I want. So if you refresh it here, because the internet is disconnected, it will throw error and it will alert a message saying check your internet connection. But let us go back to network and fix the internet by clicking on online. Let's go back to console, refresh it, and here what we will see, it will alert the name of the person after 5 seconds. That is Kyle Simpson, right? So just by using promises, we were able to solve the problem of inversion of control. Rather than we being in the control, the function that we are calling is in control, and that can get manipulated or that can have some issues in future. But here, because we have control over the data, we can just take care of it in the way that we want. But not only this, promises also has a lot of characteristics that comes with it. And that makes promises really, really powerful. So now I'll just walk you through some of the characteristics that comes with promises that makes it even more powerful. So those characteristics are, the first thing, it can only be settled once, that's all. Either it is resolved or rejected, it will only be settled once. You cannot resolve or reject a single promise multiple times. When it comes to the value you get when the promise is either resolved or rejected, it can never be changed. It is always immutable. And the third one is rejected promise will become error. What does it mean is, whenever you have a promise, say for example, you create a promise, and what this promise does, it gets access to resolve and reject. And here what you're doing, you're calling reject with a value like 21. What will happen is you can see an error here. So every promise that is reject will become error. And that is what we can see it here. The characteristics of promises are, promises can only be settled once. The value that we get when the promise is either resolved or rejected is always immutable. You cannot change that. And the last one is rejected promise will become error. So in this way, what we got to understand is what are the different in terms of thinking when we do it using callback pattern and when we use promises, or you can think about promises to be like a receipt, how it makes our life a lot more easier at any point of time. We can look at the value of the promises and see whether it is rejected, fulfilled, or is in pending state. Now we will take a look at what are the static method that is present on the promise constructor. Static method is the method you can only call on the constructor, not on the instance of a constructor. So when you say new promise, it creates a new instance, that is the object. And static method can only be called on the constructor itself. So you say promise, and when you add a dot in front of the constructor, you will get the name of all the static method on that promise. So few methods that we use a lot are resolve. So what you can do, you can resolve a promise at the same time. You don't have to write a dot then or something like that. What you can do, you can just say promise dot resolve, but make sure that you only call this resolve method on promise constructor, not on the instance, like how it is returning a new promise. So here you cannot say dot resolve. You can only call it on the promise constructor. So I want to create a promise and I want to resolve it with a value 21. What do you see? It is a promise that is resolved with a value of 21. Similarly, you can also do promise.reject. So what you're doing, you're creating a promise and rejecting at the same time. So this is equivalent to creating a promise and rejecting at the same time. So these are some of the static method that is present on promises that we can use to resolve and reject the promise at the same time. And don't forget, this method like resolve and reject can only be used on the constructor, not on the instance. And the way you create instance is by using the keyword new.